and thank you for joining us for today's virtual meeting of the Democratic National Committee Rules and Bylaws Committee. Good to see everybody. It's been so long since we've had a chance to hug and kiss and joke around. Soon though. I'm Lorraine Miller from the great hot state of Texas, and along with my friend Jim Roosevelt from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, we happen to serve as the co-chairs of the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee. We really do appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Jim and I hope that you're all doing well and you're staying safe and healthy. We look forward to a time when we can conduct these meetings in person, which we hope will be real soon. In the meantime, we appreciate your participation today and all that you do to make sure our party continues to function during these unprecedented times. As a reminder, committee members, this is an official meeting of the committee, so we are live streaming these proceedings are on the DNC's YouTube channel so that we can have an official record of our deliberations. One of the things I think Jim and I really want you guys to do today is really participate in the discussion. We've got a great meeting agenda today, and all it requires is your participation as we normally do when we meet in person. The discussions are always robust. So if you would please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Jim?
Sure, I get myself unmuted there. Thank you very much, Lorraine. And I know that both of us would like to thank all of you for your continued participation in these discussions of the 2020 reforms. And I also want to thank the dedicated DNC staff for all of their hard work to ensure that we can have these important conversations. As you know, after every presidential nominating cycle and before drafting the rules for the next process, the RBC typically meets to review the elements of the last nominating process to determine what worked well and to identify areas where changes may be needed to improve the process going forward. For this cycle, the RBC's discussion is focusing on the major 2020 reforms in 3 areas: primaries, caucuses, and automatic delegates. Our conversations during today's RBC meeting will not include the writing and implementation of rules for the next presidential nominating process. The next RBC is going to be responsible for drafting and implementing those rules for the 2024 cycle. At the 2020 Democratic National Convention, delegates approved a unity resolution authored by DNC member Larry Cohen and co-sponsored by state chairs Ken Martin, Jane Klebb, Trav Robertson, and Tina Podlowski. The resolution called on the RBC to conduct a comprehensive and structured review of the presidential nominating process and of the reforms adopted by the DNC for the 2020 process to evaluate where even further reforms are needed while maintaining the advances that have been made. On May 27, the committee looked at the reforms made to the 2020 rules concerning government-run primaries. At today's meeting, we will focus on the reforms related to caucuses and automatic delegates. Our review will consider how these reforms made the process more accessible and transparent while fulfilling the requirements of the 2016 Unity Commission's mandates, including empowering rank and file Democrats and strengthening and unifying the Democratic Party in the lead up to the general election. Today, we will hear from state party chairs from Alaska, Wyoming, and Kansas. We invited these 3 state chairs to speak to us today because they were involved in administering their state's 2020 caucus processes. Their firsthand experience will provide insights for us on the extent to which the 2020 reforms help to increase participation in the caucus process, including absentee and early voting opportunities. Then, following our discussion about the caucus reforms, we will hear from our RBC member, Elaine Kmark. Dr. Kmark will share her analysis of the reforms to the automatic delegates. Along with our committee's deliberations about the 2020 reforms, we have also heard from members and from the public who have shared their thoughts and ideas on the reforms through a survey posted on the DNC's website. During today's meeting, Lorraine and I will share some of the feedback we received to help provide a sense of the comments sent in so that they are on the record for our discussions. To begin that, one comment we received from Brianna in Minnesota, and Ken Martin, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, quote, "I think the Minnesota caucuses went well, and I like how our state party ran the process. It was weird in the pandemic, but the team did an excellent job at keeping the spirit of a caucus." I think we would all apply the word weird to our experiences over the last 18 months. As a reminder, during today's meeting, RBC members and guest speakers will automatically be muted unless they are recognized to speak, at which point they will be introduced and unmuted by the staff. After each set of presentations, we will move to Q&A, which will be limited to current and former RBC members only. If an RBC member would like to be recognized for comments or questions, please use the raise your hand feature in the Zoom. That will help us with staff assistance to create a queue that we'll use to call on each member. When it is your turn to speak, you will be announced and unmuted. Are there any questions? If you have a question, please submit it in the chat to Liz Mariapan from the Party Affairs Office, or raise your hand via Zoom, and Philip Yotevsky from the Secretary's Office will help us make sure you are recognized. I'm going to pause for just a moment here so that those lists can be assembled, and Philip will then read any submitted questions or call on any members who raised their hand.
Jim?
Yes, Lorraine.
While we're waiting for the list to be assembled, you were going to mention about our friend Patrice Taylor.
I am going to do that. Just give me a moment. I want to make sure I don't miss anything there. And I think I actually also skipped over the item on our agenda of calling the roll.
Yeah,
so
but that's fine. But I just want, yeah.
As in our previous meeting, we wanted to make sure, Lorraine and I did, that that those who served on the RBC this past cycle, but are no longer on the DNC, are still included in this important discussion about the reforms of the 2020 nominating process. Although some of our members have gone on to other things and are no longer DNC members, we value their insight and we appreciate their willingness to provide their contributions and process and participation in these meetings. And before we get to that roll call, I wanted to take just a minute to acknowledge, as Lorraine has reminded me, our friend, our colleague, our collaborator, our associate, Patrice Taylor. As you probably know, Patrice recently left the DNC to take a position as the Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Marcia Fudge. Patrice was at the DNC for 16 years. He started in the research office, but was soon hired by Phil McNamara to be his deputy in the Party Affairs and Delegate Selection Office for the 2008 cycle. When Phil left in 2009 to work in the Obama administration, Patrice became the director of the PADS operation. She directed the office through 3 convention cycles and has been absolutely wonderful to work with. She's been a real asset to our Rules and Bylaws Committee, to the DNC in general, and to the conduct of our full DNC meetings.
Absolutely.
She's become a good friend of mine and to so many of us, and we will really miss her, but we wish her well and think this is a great opportunity for her and for service to the country. I know that Chairman Harrison and the DNC staff are conducting a search for a new Party Affairs and Delegate Selection Director. But in the meantime, we are fortunate to have Rick Boylan serving.
Yay!
Rick was the first Party Affairs and Delegate Selection Director, officially left the DNC in 2001, but you may not have noticed because he's continued to be a resource that we call on frequently for all of us. So I am now going to ask Rick to call the roll of the RBC members who are participating today. There will be no votes during this meeting, so we do not need to actually establish a quorum, but for the record, we want to establish who is present.
Who is present?
Thanks, thanks so much. Hi, everybody. I didn't really ever expect to be in this role, and like you, I know all of us miss Patrice continuing on, but wish her all the best. For the role, I will start by calling Jeff Berman.
Yeah, here.
Great. Artie Blanco.
Presente.
Donna Brazil.
Present.
Excellent. Scott Brennan.
Present.
Raymond Buckley. I see you there, Raymond. So I will mark you down as present. Maria Cardona. I don't believe that Maria is with us today. Reverend Leah Daughtry.
Present.
Great. Carol Fowler.
Present.
Great. Alexandra Giardo Roker, I'm sorry.
Presente.
Thank you. Barry Goodman.
Present.
Rebecca Higgins.
Here.
Harold Dickies. I don't see Harold. Don't believe Harold is with us. Elaine Kmark.
Here.
Great. Frank Leone.
Happy to be here.
Great. Yvette Lewis.
Here.
Okay. Chris Liu.
Here.
Iris Martinez.
Presente.
Excellent.
Hey.
David Mcdonald.
He's got to be here.
Yep, there you go. Ken Martin.
Here.
Great. Mignon Moore. I don't see Mignon. Okay. Judy Mount.
Here.
Okay.
Hey, Judy.
Michael Nutter. He said that he may be joining a little bit late. Jason Ray.
Present.
Great. Amy Ruse. Okay. Lee Saunders.
Here.
Great. Dennis Spate.
Present.
Okay. Kathy Sullivan. Okay. Susan Swecker.
Here.
Great. Randy Weingarten. And John Zodi. And we have a very full attendance of committee members.
Yes,
Great.
thank you. We would normally say we have a quorum, but we
Yes.
don't need to say that today. In addition to the Rules and Bylaws Committee members who are on the line, we're also joined by members of the DNC staff, our DNC counsel, Graham Wilson and Andy Levin, and our parliamentarian, Helen McFadden. We appreciate each of them being here to help make sure our meeting runs smoothly. So now I'll return to where we had asked for questions or comments from members of the committee, and I'll ask Philip if any were submitted.
You were not, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will then now, having done what I was supposed to do just in a slightly different order, turn it over to my good friend Lorraine.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Okay, guys, we're going to, as Jim mentioned, today we'll hear from 3 state party chairs who will share their experiences pertaining to their presidential caucuses that this past year. Speaking to us today are the chairs from Alaska, Wyoming, and Kansas. As you may recall, the reforms the caucuses made for the 2020 process included, let me just kind of reiterate, so refresh your memory on what we were looking at. 1, providing for absentee voting and other mechanisms for voters who could not participate in person. Requiring state parties to demonstrate the technical and financial ability to run a caucus. 3, providing for votes cast in writing to allow for a recount if needed. 4, locking in the allocation of all national convention delegates based on the first level of voting. And 5, and the last, creating a process for publicly reporting statewide and district level results for each candidate. And that's what the reforms set out. So we've asked each of the state chairs to discuss the following. 1, whether their caucuses saw an increase in participation from 2016, and if they did, why? 2, what type of absentee voting or early voting they provided and their experience with it. And 3rd and last, any other way their processes made it easier for voters to participate. Following the presentation by our chairs, we will open the floor for questions and answers from members. We're hoping, members, that you will listen carefully and engage with our chairs about all of this, because that's the only way we determine if what we did worked or if we need to make some improvements. So our first speaker is the state chair, Casey Steno, who will let us know about the 2020 caucus experience in the great state of Alaska. Casey, thank you so much for joining us today. Is it morning or night there?
It is morning, Madam Chair.
Great. You got the floor, Casey.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. As the chairwoman said, my name is Casey Steinow, and I am the chair of the Alaska Democratic Party. We historically have always been a caucus state, and so in order for us to make these reforms, we did things a little differently. One of the things we started at the beginning of the year was that we sent out postcards to all registered Democrats in the state, letting them know kind of what the process was and how we were going to do things a little differently. So part of our plan obviously was to make sure people were engaged early in the process and understood what was coming. We then mailed out ballots, written ballots with return envelopes to all the folks who are registered Democrats as of February 18th of the year. And we sent those out in early March, and we mailed 71,106 ballots out to folks across the state. We also had the opportunity for folks to request an absentee ballot from the party headquarters to ensure that we were able to handle folks who were perhaps out of state or not in where they got their mail. We also made available the ballots to be downloaded so that people could print them out and mail them in, whether that was because they did not receive their ballot, or we also wanted to make sure in Alaska, we have always allowed folks to change their registration in order to participate same day. So what we did in that particular case was we also allowed folks to download an application to change their registration. Then they could mail that in with the ballot. We had a massively successful, I would say, participation. We went to about double from what we have had in the past. So we were very excited to process slightly over 19,700 ballots at the state. We did that all volunteer done. So that was some challenges, a little staff and help, but I can't tell you enough the hard work that went into it with our volunteers to make sure that that happened, and with our staff. I would say this is the first time that many people in the state of Alaska ever got a chance to participate in the selection of the president and of our delegates. We got calls from villages across the state. I talked to people on islands where they would never have had the ability to actually physically go to a caucus. So I can say with confidence that not only, again, was it a success, but that so many people got to participate that never ever had that opportunity. And I would encourage the Rules and Bylaws Committee as we move forward to ensure that would happen across the country. And that concludes my presentation.
You know, if I could start off with the first question. Since you are such a large state, slightly larger than Texas, and you're kind of remote, how did the mailing, and then you had it down, people could download the ballot? So that's something you traditionally had not done, especially the downloading of the ballot?
We have never historically had a ballot by mail. We were a straight caucus state, so people would go to their locations. Exactly.
Yeah. And you think that really helped increase your participation?
Oh, absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, it just as far as geography, it allowed people who had never had the ability to participate without having to get on, at the very least, a boat, but more often an airplane in order to participate. So the ability to mail.
Okay, great. Billy, do we have any other questions in the queue?
Yes, we do, Chair. We have Frank Leone with a hand raised, and feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself when you're available.
I wanted to clarify, did you have any in-person voting, or was it essentially the whole quote caucus was a mail-in party-run primary, you might even call it?
Originally, we had the ability to do both mail and come to a physical space, Frank. But in March, our executive committee determined with COVID, that it would no longer be safe for just the public and our volunteers who worked it. So we eliminated that portion of it.
Just to follow up, and appreciate that. Now, the next time around, hopefully there's no COVID to deal with, but would you anticipate doing any in person, or did it work so well by mail-in that you might want to leave it that way all the time?
I think I would leave that up to the executive committee at the time to make that decision, but I think the mail worked extremely well. And the one thing that doing the in-person would allow of that same exact day, so someone could walk in on that day, change their registration, and participate. I would say that's probably the only thing that we couldn't do as a result. But I would encourage the future committees to absolutely go with voting by mail. Although, again, there's a cost to that has to be determined in the future.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you.
All right, Chair. And we have Donna Brazil with a hand raised. We will go ahead and unmute you and feel free to ask her question.
Frank asked part of my question. When in-person voting was canceled due to the pandemic, you switched to mail-in voting. That was extended by a week, right?
It was actually, we extended it, I believe, 2 weeks. Donna, I'd have to look on the exact one, but we made sure that we allowed folks the opportunity to get those ballots in later. And so we pushed it to April 10th was the last day folks could get those in.
And did you have any problems with getting ballots in? We all know last year, the post office, U.S. Post Office, was just horrible in getting ballots in and so forth, and much more. What was your experience with dealing with the post office?
It was kind of interesting, the informed delivery. We saw people think that they were getting their ballot, but then not get a ballot, even though they were informed that they would be getting it per the post office. And we had quite a few people who we knew we mailed them a ballot, but they didn't receive it. So that was also helpful for them to be able to download that ballot and get it into us in a timely manner. But there was definitely, I know the post office worked very, very hard to help get us everything, but I think there are some challenges with that.
You mailed because it was a closed party run caucus. You mailed how did you determine who would get a ballot?
So we mailed them to every registered Democrat in the state who was registered as a Democrat as of February 18th.
Okay, and one last question. Ranked choice voting, how did that go in your state? With that, I turn back.
Nope, and I apologize for not speaking on that at the beginning. It went very well. People understood it. We did a lot of education to help folks, who hadn't done it in the past. But the only challenge on that was having the names on the ballot of folks who had withdrawn. In other words, because we had to print the ballots in a certain amount of time and get them out. So what we then did is made sure that we had a list on our website available of all the folks who were no longer viable. And if they had a vote cast, it just went to their next. If it was cast.
So had dropped out by April 4th, although you print the ballots, the ballot early, the candidates who had dropped out, you notified as many people as possible. And what was the participation rate of the Native population? I know that is a very important population that we try to, in terms of voter protection. The participation rate of the Native American community out in Alaska.
Donna, I don't know that statistic, but I can tell you confidently that it was radically increased. again, because of all of the different villages and the places where people just weren't physically able to participate previously in the caucus structure.
And one last question, Lorraine and Jim, forgive me, but you relied solely on the post office, or did you also have drop boxes or other ways that voters could get their ballots to you?
We relied solely on the post office.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Stevie. Philippe?
Yes, and the next hand raised is Jeff Bermans. Feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
I can.
Hi, Jeff.
Hey, so the question I have is on the reporting of the results. When were the results reported?
I believe it was April 11th.
Okay, so this was an April 10 date, is that right? That for
Yes.
the primary, was that was April 10 the original deadline or the revised deadline?
That one was a revised deadline. We pushed that back in order to make sure folks could participate.
Right, okay. So everybody had an extra 2 weeks to get the ballots in, and then you were able to report them the day after.
Yes.
Everything was in. Okay, that's pretty good. Did you happen to get a sense of how many ballots, just sort of as a general percentage, came in during that 2-week extension period?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question, but I do know that we got a significant portion in that latter portion, in the latter time frame.
Mm-hmm.
But I honestly don't have the numbers in front of me on that one.
Yeah, and the original rule was they had to be in by the day of the election, is that right? It not just postmarked or something?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Do you think in retrospect, you think that's the best rule, or do you think it would be better to have something like a postmark date?
Well, it turns out that in Alaska, postmark is a real challenging thing to achieve. So if somebody drops their mail, for example, in a village, it then gets sent into Anchorage and then it gets postmarked. And in fact, some things don't get postmarked at all. So as we look at postmarks, that is one of the challenges we face in our state.
Mm-hmm. Does it, I guess in the last question on this, does it make sense to do what you did this time on a regular basis, which is to have some additional period to allow for kind of the fluidity in the mail in Alaska, as opposed to having that hard deadline on the election day?
It certainly could. I think the question would be how we would then determine, if we tried to use the postmark, what that looked like. But I mean, I think the longer time period people have to mail it in, obviously, I believe the better.
When did you first send the ballots out? What day did you send?
I believe we sent them out March. I'm going to have to look at my notes. I'm sorry. I believe they went out at the middle of March.
So they had them for 2 or 3 weeks before they were due.
Assuming that I think we know from anecdotal information that not everyone got them at the exact same time.
Yeah, right. Especially in Alaska with the size of the state.
Yeah, it's just mail is a little more, it takes a little bit more time.
Yeah. I wonder if in a future cycle it pays to try and move the dates back just a little bit to give a little more time for that process. Sounds like it might have been pretty tight. If it would take somebody a week or two for their ballot to get in, and it would take a week or two for that ballot you sent out, in mid or late March, I mean, there's not a lot of time.
Yeah, a lot of lessons learned that we didn't know about that process, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, and
thank you.
Congrats. Doubling the participation, obviously, that's huge.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, very excited about that.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. Philip?
Yes, up next we have Chris Liu. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Casey, we spent a lot of time 2 years ago talking about technology-based solutions, in part to reach the Native population. Based on everything over the past 2 years, and as we think about, or as the next RBC thinks about technology for 2024, do you think mail-in is an acceptable alternative, or should we consider other technology-based solutions?
I would love to see technology-based solutions based primarily on cost. I think that ultimately would be helpful. But I think given that we did such a good job with the mail and on our participation, I think some form of a blended thing might be in order. Thank you.
Okay. Chris,
All right.
you got your question answered? Philippe?
Yes, up next we have David Mcdonald.
Thank you. Hi, Casey.
Hi.
I had a general comment and then a question for you and for the other chairs that will be speaking. My general comment was, as somebody who was at the front end of the COVID situation, which unfortunately is still going on, and had just shifted away from a caucus, one of our recurring nightmares was if we had not shifted away, how would we have run a caucus system? And I have kind of the same reaction to the RBC reforms, but for the fact that we required some form of absentee voting for the caucus states, I think this whole cycle could have been very difficult to administer. But system-wide, nationwide crises, fortunately, don't come up very often, but local ones do. And I know, for example, in Washington, I've seen situations where floods have prevented postal workers from getting to the mailbox in order to pick up the mail, in order to postmark it, so that even though the voters had deposited their ballot, they couldn't get it. And that leads me to the following question for everybody. Actually, two questions. One, have you had experience with local disasters in connection with the caucus system, where, say, you might have a fire in a region that disrupts your ability to have meetings, or you might have an electricity or internet outage? And if you've had those kind of local problems that suddenly disrupt the process, how did you deal with them in the past? And then related to that is kind of a question for, maybe not for an answer, but for Lorraine and Jim to think about in terms of the next RBC. Is there adequate authority and process in place in our rules for a last minute change to be made? I mean, for example, an extension of a week to receive the ballots was done. That could be viewed as minor, or if you are in a very close race and those ballots that come in a week later, due to the mail process, appear to change the outcome, it could turn out to be substantive. So do we have an appropriate process for saying, in a regular election, you would go to a court and you would say, the equipment didn't show up, we need an extra hour or two, but somebody blesses that. Do we need a general authority someplace in our rules to allow us to deal with last minute emergencies in party run processes where they don't have immediate access to the courts? And those were my two questions.
So thanks, David. I don't recall a time where we had a problem, natural disaster, et cetera, where we couldn't have the caucus. We've had to move them because of participation was so high that the fire department said you have to go somewhere else. But I don't think we've ever, to my knowledge, had a problem with that. And I think the second question was for Lorraine. And
well, it's something we'll consider. Okay. Guys, we've got, I see Rebecca and Leah Daughtry, and those will be our last two questions on this segment so we can move it along, because I don't want Joe to think that he's left out there in the wilderness. So, Billy, if Rebecca Higgins and then Leah Daughtry, then we'll wrap this segment up.
Thank you, Lorraine. And thank you, Casey, for all your hard work. It's really impressive what you were able to accomplish. Just really quickly, you said you had many, many first-time voters this time around. So my question is, have you done any follow-up with those first-time voters to see if they want to be more involved, or have they shown interest about being more involved at the local or state level with the party?
We've been doing a lot of outreach to try and participate stuff, but actually, like, specifically to the voters, the answer would be no, only because of not keeping track of who voted. I don't know if that makes sense.
Is that possible to keep track of who voted?
I think, you know, again, this would be a staff question for me. I know that we had, I don't know that we went individually. There is a spreadsheet of some sort where people checked in ballots. So I think potentially that could be something we could go back and look at if we had to.
Yeah, if it wouldn't be a huge cost factor, I think that would be a good idea. Maybe
it's a great idea.
Just to keep their involvement up and their excitement, because I'm sure they were very excited about having the chance this time around. So anyway, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Great question. Reverend Daughtry?
Hello, everyone, and Madam Chair. This is a very quick question. I'm wondering, since all the ballots were sent to every registered voter, was the return postage paid by the voter, or was it prepaid by the party? Just interested in costs, potential costs involved.
Sure. So it's actually a two-part answer in that, yes, the ones that we sent folks, the return postage was on the party. The only difference was if someone printed out their ballot and put it in an envelope, we didn't have the ability to cover that postage, but yes, we did. Thank you.
Great. You done, Ms. Daughtry? This is great questions, guys. This is how we tease, and Casey, love you for what you've done and what you're doing, and to answer the questions that our members have. This is very helpful, and we appreciate you so much.
My absolute pleasure, and thank you to all of you for the work you do.
Well, and you too. Have a great day. Next, members, we'll hear from the state chair, Joe Bartolo. Joe will provide his insights on the Wyoming's 2020 caucus experience. Joe, we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. The floor is yours. Good to see you.
It's good to see you, Chairman Roosevelt, and members of the committee. I'm glad to be here today. She said, I'm Joe Barbuto. I'm chair of the Wyoming Democratic Party. And we had quite the time in 2020, as all of you did, hosting this caucus. You know, from the very beginning, before we knew anything else, we knew that we had to increase participation in our caucus here in Wyoming, because even in exciting years, 2012 and 2008 for us, the participation rates were well under 20%, of registered Democrats. And so early on, we started talking about what we could do to make it possible to include more people. And of course, that was the mail-in option. And you know, there are a lot of people who missed that traditional caucus. And I always say, I think it's a little bit misleading, because when you go to a gym or you go to this public community center, or wherever you're having your caucus, and you see a room full of other Democrats, you feel like every Democrat in the state is participating, but the truth is very few are. And there are barriers in Wyoming sometimes to making the caucus, especially that time of year. Weather is one of the biggest concerns. We're a large state that's sparsely populated, so there are people who don't live in those population centers, and it is a big deal. I mean, if there was a question about natural disasters. I mean, if a blizzard comes in, that'll keep a lot of people home too, and that has happened in previous years with our caucuses and with other party events. You know, it's a state where people don't work traditional hours, so there's that barrier as well on occasion. And then just the lack of historical contact and participation that we've had as a party. We've failed, I think, to reach out in an effective way to Democratic voters in the state. Our original plan, of course, was to have some sort of a mixed caucus. So like in Alaska, every Democratic voter in Wyoming received a ballot in the mail that was with postage paid. And we allowed till, I think, around March 20th for people to vote or to register. And so after that initial period, because we had to move that back a little too, we did actually end up doing a second wind, if you will, of ballots. So things as COVID-19 became more of an issue for us, things did change. First, we knew we had to cancel the in-person ballots, but we did have a system where you could mail them in or take them to a drop-off point. So because lots of our volunteers are members of populations that were particularly at risk for COVID-19, they did not feel comfortable with the drop-offs even. So we moved entirely to a mail-in system. And I'll tell you that mail-in worked because of ranked choice voting. You didn't have that opportunity like you do at a traditional caucus to move to the other side of the room if your candidate doesn't break that necessary barrier, but this ranked choice voting allowed that to happen on paper. You only missed the fun of a caucus and the chance for people to scream at you and tell you why you ought to be supporting their candidate next. Mm-hmm. So ranked choice RCV was a game changer for us. So we did end up going to a fully mail-in vote. We had to push that date back like they did in Alaska for those ballots to come in. We did run into some smaller issues with the post office. There's only a few processing centers for the post office in Wyoming, so some of the mail, for instance, had to be routed through Salt Lake City, which would add an additional 2 days for some people on the western side of the state. But it actually didn't end up posing a serious problem, and partially because I think we knew that was going to be the case ahead of hand. We were able to put a little preparation in place. It involved a lot of, and again, before COVID was a thing, this involved a lot of education at the local level. We worked closely with our county parties and local media outlets to let Democrats know how this process would work, how they could vote. And then we had to do it all again, let them how they could vote now because COVID changed everything. But we had good partnerships at those local levels. And I think the statistic was something along the lines of the ballots we received back, because a ranked choice ballot is confusing for some folks who've never seen one before. But of the ballots we received back, 99.76% of them were filled out correctly, which is pretty impressive, I think. And like in Alaska, the final result we saw was that our participation increased from 2016, we had 17.6% of our Democrats participate. In 2008, 14.7% of Democrats participated. In 2020, we had 38% of Wyoming Democrats participate in this caucus by mail. And what's particularly amazing about that to me is that by the time our caucus was happening, even earlier on, we knew who the nominee was going to be. A lot of people still participated after knowing that the race was decided. And so I think back to 2016 and 2008, when that was not necessarily the case at the time we held our caucuses in Wyoming those years. I imagine that if it had been, our participation would have been even greater, but it is a wonderful place to start. There are a lot of Democrats who we contacted for the first time. This was the first interaction they had with the Wyoming Democratic Party in the 2020 caucus. So we've been able to engage those people, and we are able to follow up with them and include them in the things that are happening at the county level, at the state level, helping them become better acquainted with the ways they can volunteer and be a part of the party. And that's been, of course, any of you who are responsible for engaging more people, volunteers, voters, and anybody else know what a chore that can be. So anytime you can get that many more folks involved, it's a real godsend. And I would say that in the future, we hope to be a primary state, right? That's still our goal. We don't want to run a caucus if we don't have to. We'd much prefer the state to run a primary. But because that doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime too soon, we're going to continue to pursue this if we can, and maybe staying strictly with all mail-in voting for the caucus, and then counties can hold their individual county conventions to elect delegates after that process is over. But I mean, the proof is in the result for us. We had a very successful caucus as a result of that marriage between ranked choice voting and the mail-in system. And so I'd be glad to stand for any questions you have now.
Thank you, Joe. So the mail-in ballots, ranked choice voting, you followed up with voters. So those kind of are your key ingredients to your success. So I guess my question is, you got 38% of performance of Democratic voters. How do you get from 38 to 90?
Yeah. So 38% of the registered voters as of March 20th, 2020, right. Whatever. So 30% of them. That's so maybe follow. What was your question exactly?
No, so maybe follow up is a good way to increase that percentage so you can get to 90. And that's something you're already doing. Great.
Yeah, and in the next caucus, we assume that it'll be President Biden, assuming he's the nominee. It might be a little less engagement. It may be harder to get engagement because of that, obviously, but we'll look for ways. We have time now to think of other ways we can make sure that that's a growing caucus in 2024.
Great. Philippe, who do we have with hands raised, ready to go with questions?
Chair, we have Lee Saunders up first.
I'm intrigued by the statement I believe you made at the end, saying that you'd really like to move toward a primary rather than a caucus. Could you explain why you're saying that and what you believe the advantages to be?
Well, I mean, the biggest advantage for us is it's expensive to run a caucus. It costs money, of course. But the bigger point is that when you have a primary election, you are going to have more people participate in that state-run election. And since I've been involved with the state party, which was before I was chair, that's something we've been trying to move towards. At one time in Wyoming, even the Wyoming Republican Party was interested in moving to that primary system. But since then, I think that they've kind of dropped that. I don't know that they're still in favor of it. But that really was the big point, is that we knew more people would participate in the primary if it was a state-run process.
Lee, was that it?
That's it.
Good to see you. Philippe, who will we have next?
We have Donna Brazil up next.
Okay.
Joe, you did a great job. You doubled turnout from 2016 from over 7,000 to more than 15,000. But on March 22nd, you moved to mail-in voting soon after the virus began to take hold of our entire primary schedule. You gave voters, 13 days to turn in their ballot from April 4th, which would have been the in-person date, to April 17th. Am I correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Wyoming is one of those states famous for same-day voter registration. So my question is, how did you incorporate that into this plan? I know you had to move quickly. Bernie Sanders dropped out on April 8th, but how did you incorporate same-day registration for those voters who wanted to participate, in that time period?
Yeah, I mean, that was, we didn't have, you couldn't have true same-day registration unless you went to the clerk's office by that, I think it was March 20th date. So if you weren't registered to vote by that date, then you weren't able to participate in that caucus, and that's a rule we had to make as a part of it, just because we don't have the capability. Of course, some counties in Wyoming may have the agreement with their county clerks to register voters, but that's not true statewide. So we did have to work closely, though, with our county clerks across the state to make sure we knew what kind of rules and regulations were in place as a result of COVID-19 protocols for them, and make sure that we were getting that information then down to our county parties and Democrats across the state, so they knew how that they could register to vote, whether or not they, mailed an application that was notarized, or if they went to the county courthouse where they could register and call ahead and make an appointment, things like that. And we did see, I don't know what the increase was in voter registration numbers off the top of my head, but we did see a small increase, small but noticeable increase in the number of Democratic registered voters who participated on March 20th, as opposed to who participated in, or who were registered to vote on whatever date in January we had originally checked.
Okay. All right. I'll follow up again with you on that, because I was just trying to figure out how you incorporated, same-day voter registration when you moved the primary on March 22nd from an in-person process to by mail, and those individuals who were probably planning on doing it but had not yet registered to vote. So anyway, thank you, Joe. You did have a tremendous turnout over 2016. Congratulations.
Great. Joe, we've got one question here from Artie Blanco. I'm going to bum rush you in. She has a question. Her internet's not working as well. Her question is, since it was all mail to current registered Democrats, what was the voter registration deadline?
It was a date, I think the deadline was March 20th. If you weren't registered by that date in the system. So in the Secretary of State's office, we'd get that report and put in the vote builder. But if you weren't registered by that March 20th date is what I recall. But honestly, 2020 is like 20 years ago at this point. That was, if you're registered by that date, you were eligible to participate in the Wyoming Democratic Presidential Caucus.
Okay, great. We have 3 hands raised, Philip. David Mcdonald, Jeff Berman, and Dennis H. from the great state of Texas. And if we could, let's take these guys, and then we'll need to move on to our last state chair.
Yes, Chair.
Okay.
First is Jeff Berman.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Just wanted to follow up something in your response to Lee's question. Had to do with the cost. I'm just curious, what in general terms are the cost implications of moving from an assembled caucus to the mail-in caucus, and what were your main cost components? The outbound mail, the payment for the return envelope mail. How did you see that?
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. I mean, most of the cost of the mail-in caucus is more than the traditional caucus, for sure, where, I mean, most of your expenses are around room rentals and things like that if you have to have it. So our big cost was all related to postage in 2020, and it was a lot. I mean, this would not be as big of a price tag as it is in many other states, but it still was a big price tag to send out all those ballots here in Wyoming. And so if we're to continue doing this in the future, in 2020, we had some good angel investors, people who are particularly interested in this process and the ranked choice voting, who helped us out. Of course, we don't have any commitment in 2024. They're still going to be interested in doing that. But if we know that that's the process that we're going to be pursuing again, then we can start early on fundraising for that and making sure that we have the resources needed to pull it off successfully.
Yeah, would you say it doubled the cost in general terms, or less, or more?
That would be hard for me to say, because in the past, a lot of the costs incurred in the caucus are probably incurred at the county party level, and I don't know exactly what they are spending in their individual counties and their respective counties. But I can say it's a significant increase in cost. But again, the payoff for that is that we get more people involved than we ever have had before, and we're connecting with people still that we'd never connected with before. And that's, I mean, that really is worth the cost in my eyes.
Yeah, sounds like there was maybe a little bit of a cost shift then from the county level to the state, because you had to bear the postage costs alone, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Billy?
Yes, up next we have David Mcdonald. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Hi, Joe. I have a couple of questions. Let me give you the context, I guess. I know when we have done caucuses in the past, one of the problems we've had that is a recent problem is people getting their information about how the caucus works from somebody in some other state with a different set of rules, but they found it on the internet. And with that background, my questions actually had to do with your use of ranked choice voting, and you indicated it gave people the opportunity by absentee to do what they could have done at the caucus. And that leads me to three questions. One, was it the same opportunity or was it more opportunity? In other words, did you get one switch at the caucus and maybe you got 2 or 3 possible switches? Second, was your process for ranked choice voting in your caucus the same as in all the other states that used it for caucuses? For example, Nevada used it. And then finally, in the bigger picture, how do you think your voter education might have been impacted if instead of last year you were doing your caucuses this year and you had just had all the networks spending about a month talking about how ranked choice voting works in New York City and explaining the whole process if it turned out to not be your rules, which is a predicate for my general question for the next Rules Committee as to whether the rules for use of ranked choice voting, not necessarily mandating its use, but saying if it is used, whether those rules should be standard and somehow consistent with what people are going to see in other news sources in order to reduce voter confusion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. And in every envelope, with every ballot they received, they were given pretty clear and concise instructions on how that was to be completed, that process. And it included information on if you did have questions, who to call, who to email, or who to contact in general to find answers to that. And we were able to, beforehand, train our county party leaders and those who would be the caucus chairs or the caucus leaders in the process too, so that they could also have a knowledge of the process and share that with people who had any questions. And we did field a number of questions, and I'm sure that there was at some time misinformation out there. A lot of people, it can be a confusing process. A lot of people didn't understand, for instance, how the ranking worked. They assumed that that we would only take their first one. And I mean, why would we go through the process if we only take the first one, right? I mean, we pay attention to the entire ballot, but we're able to overcome that. We're lucky in Wyoming. Sometimes this is not a great thing. We don't have a lot of statewide media. In fact, there's only one statewide newspaper, for instance, and no statewide TV affiliates that are sharing news. So we really depend on our local news outlets and hyper-local media outlets that are online now, and they were really a pleasure to work with this, and they took the time and effort to make sure that information was out there too on their sites and on a regular basis, not just once. We were able to send out regular updates, and they were able to get those printed and published online and in paper and on the radio on occasions too. And was there another question there I missed?
I think you covered the ground, and in the interest of time, I won't follow up. Go ahead.
Thanks. Philippe?
Yes, and last question for this section is Dennis Spite.
Hey, Joe, thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Quick question. You made the statement that y'all would prefer a primary system. I think I heard that. And it sounds like y'all have a mandated caucus system at the state level. What did 2020's election cause any new effort at the state legislature to go to a primary system? You said in the past the Republicans have been interested in it, but it seems to have waned. Is there any new effort to move that direction?
Yeah, their leadership has changed to the degree that anything that used to be the case is probably not the case anymore with the Republicans here. That said, you know, in a way, we might have shot ourselves in the foot a little bit because it did go so well and we were able to increase participation as much as we did that it's very likely that some legislators, particularly those of the Republican persuasion, will say to us, well, why do you need a primary if your concern is turnout? It looks like you're already taking care of that with your caucus. But the fact of the matter is we'll still get a lot of more people involved in a state-run primary. And going back to something Donna Brazil was asking about, you know, if in a state-run primary, you do have that opportunity to register right there at the polls, which includes a whole another group of people that maybe we weren't able to reach as successfully, right? So it's something we'll continue pursuing. One of the issues is that our primary is fairly late in the year. It's the second Tuesday in August. And so we would need to have either the entire primary election move up in the year to the spring, or have two primary elections, one for the presidential races and one for the rest of the races. And right now, you know, just for budget issues alone, it's probably not going to be something our legislature and other lawmakers pursue. So it's still really an uphill battle. And so, I mean, knowing that it's going to be difficult to get to that point, we're going to have to continue to work on ways to improve the process we have in place right now to engage even more folks.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you guys for your questions and your discussions. This is going to be helpful. Thank you, Din Din. All right, so we're going to our last state chair now. Joe, thank you. Love you. Appreciate the work you're doing. Continue it.
Absolutely.
For a traditionally red state, you got some blue mixed in there. Right. And now we'll hear from the chair of our Kansas Democratic Party, Vicki Hyde. Vicki will share her overview of the 2020 Kansas caucus and how changes to the caucus process increased voter participation from past election cycles. Vicki, the floor is yours. Good to see you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think I'm going to have the assistance of a presentation of the tech people can help me out here. But I also saw just a little while ago those awful words where you see your internet is unstable. So I hope I stay with you all. But just a little bit, I actually had put several PowerPoints together just to go out and train about our party-run presidential primary that we held in 2020 to do a lot of teaching. I'm actually a retired teacher, so it wasn't a big stretch, and I wanted to go out and traveled around the state to share with everyone what the differences would be. Next slide. So originally, when we put our plan together, we had some of the main aspects that some of the other states had, that there would be voting centers. We were using paper ballots. Unaffiliated and other party voters could register even on the day of. We actually had our primary set for, the date was set for May 2nd. So it was pretty late. We were looking to get as many Kansans as we could to be delegates and participate in the whole convention thing. And so that's why we chose a late date, and unregistered voters could register. Originally, we designed that they could register on May 2nd, and we were using the ranked choice ballots. Next slide. So the first four things up here, after in March, we had to pretty much delete and change the plan. And at March 28th, we submitted a new plan to the Rules and Bylaws Committee. Next slide. And on March 30th, we actually released a press release to everyone saying that the 2020 primary would be conducted completely by mail. We had Those voting centers, we were relying on schools and different community centers around the state. County chairs found those places for us, and we were getting messages, even though we'd already set most of those up, we were getting messages back saying, oh no, we're not having anybody in our buildings. So we knew we had to go completely to the mail system and shut down all the voting centers. Next slide. So we resubmitted our delegate selection plan to the RBC, and it was approved on March 28th. And basically we decided it would be this party-run primary. And in order to participate, we would reach out to all of the registered Democrats, and they would receive this mail ballot. And the ballots would be mailed by March 30th. We sent a supplemental ballot mailing on April 7th to allow some newly registered Democrats to get on. And then we continued to allow people to, as they got new registrations, and we have kind of a neat system. There's a system that was developed by a man who ran for Secretary of State in 2018, where people can actually register to vote on their cell phones. And so they just needed to show us some proof that they had done that, and we could go ahead and include them up until a later date, and we would get them a ballot. All of these ballots had to be into our party, our headquarters, by Saturday, May 2nd, by the last delivery of the mail. Next slide. And of course, it was all the same standard things for a presidential candidate to get on the ballot. We went by what the RBC, or Rules and Bylaws Committee had addressed. Next slide. And we used the ranked choice ballot. Our original draft of the ranked choice ballot had about 10 candidates on it. But by the time, and of course, when all of this is going into being printed, by the time it was actually printed, we were down to about 5 candidates. And of course, being so late in the whole primary cycle, basically it was, I think even Bernie had kind of dropped off by that time. And so we were so nervous about whether we'd get any participation at this point. But we hung in there, and we told people that it was important for them to make their voice heard. So next slide. So we mailed the ballots out, and the ballot had, the mailing had the ballot, it had ballot instructions, it had what was called a secrecy sleeve, and then it had the return envelope, and all of this was postage paid. So all they had to do was fill out their ballot, put it in the return envelope, and send it back to us. Next slide. And as we got a lot of help and support from especially an outside agency, someone who had worked with lots of mail balloting before, and we had these qualified consultants who helped us make sure we had some election security and to make sure that we demonstrated reasonable safeguards against any error or fraud when there was voting by mail included. Just as a side, in our state, we have had a former Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, so voter fraud is a big thing here. We wanted to make sure that no one was going to accuse us of that happening. So we tried to be as careful about that with all of these qualified consultants. Next slide. So the process, we started receiving, the ballots went out March 30th. We started receiving the ballots about the end of the first week of April. And we had election, and what we did as a staff is we accumulated all of those, and then the last week, right before, like 3 or 4 days before the primary date, we actually went through the process of scanning all of these, but we had them all very carefully put in folders and organized so that the scanning went very, very quickly. I was very impressed with Dominion was the company that helped us out, and I was very impressed with the work that they did. Next slide. And so we accumulated all of these ballots, and we kept them at the headquarters until the conclusion of the Democratic National Convention. And we wanted to make sure and kept them in a secure spot in case there was any question and we needed to do any kind of a recount. We were very, very focused on accountability to make sure that this was a well-run election and nobody would question what had taken place. Next slide. And so then for the final results, we had the results tabulated by May 3rd. The election was finished basically the evening of May 2nd. And by May 3rd, we knew that Vice President Joe Biden won with 76.9% of the popular vote. And we had a participation record that we met. 146,873 ballots came in. And we had a turnout rate of 34.7% of our Democrats participated. Next slide. So the results overall, the 34.7 voter turnout, we didn't hit the rate that Wyoming did, but in 2016, our turnout rate for our caucuses, where you had to go to the caucus place setting, we had only 8.7% of our Democrats in the state turnout. So we were able to bring it from 8.7 to 34.7 in terms of. And we had 5 presidential choices on the ballot. Obviously, some, you know, like I think Elizabeth Warren was still on the ballot, and some people are saying, well, this person's dropped out. And I said, you know, that's the beauty of ranked choice voting, is you can vote for them anyway, but your second choice may be the one that counts. So if they didn't hit the 15% cutoff there. And we actually mailed out more than over 400,000 ballots. It was about 400,000 on the first mailing, and then as we got more requests coming in, because we had people changing party, changing to be Democrats, and so we had increased that. And again, the results: 76.9% for Joe Biden and 23.1% for Bernie Sanders. So some of my overall takeaways, I think it was we got very positive response from our Democratic voters. Out of about 82 responses from our online form, only 7 were of a negative or unsupportive thing. But most of the comments were things like, so happy that this caucuses are going to go away. This will make it so much more convenient for everyone to participate, especially people with disabilities and their family caregivers. Thank you. And I think that probably came up more often than anything, was so many people are disenfranchised from the in-person caucuses, especially if they have disabilities and they just can't travel some distances to go to those caucuses. And there was a big support for the ranked choice ballots as well. We got a lot of earned media from over 35 media outlets that wanted to interview us and talk to us about this new standard we were setting here in Kansas. Obviously, there was a dramatic increase in voter turnout from 2016 to 2020. And ranked choice voting, I believe, is really a good substitute for that voter realignment that takes place during a caucus process, because you could just go with, this is my first choice, my second choice, my third choice, et cetera. Mail ballots worked very well for us. And obviously, as we were so thankful we had already put that all in place, because when COVID hit, I don't know how we could not have started that from the beginning. We had been designing and putting the ballots together starting in January, weekly having meetings to go over how that mail ballot was going to look and how it was going to go out. So we were very thankful that the mail ballots were available. And the overall cost is definitely one of the challenges, especially to a small state party such as the Kansas Democrats. And the final cost was upwards of $750,000. We were very, very fortunate to have some good people who were supporting what we were doing and were really helping from out of state with lots of some donations. So that was helpful. Next slide. And our KDP staff worked long hours and weekends to process thousands of ballots. We have a staff of about 5 at that time, I think. So they put in huge efforts. Next slide. And we processed there were over 200 boxes of ballots that were processed and stored. So it was pretty impressive to finally, and we have these all, like I said, very, very organized. There were 100 ballots in each folder and 10 folders in each box, and we knew exactly where a ballot was, so we could do an audit. Next slide. So we did a risk limiting audit. And we randomly selected a sample of ballots and worked with a company that they then had the results from the scanning machines. And we compared, by just pulling out a certain ballot, compared it with the readout from the scanner, and concluded that there was a measured risk of, we had a measured risk of 2.3%, which was successfully below the risk limit of 5%. So the voters who participated in the caucus should feel confident that their ballot was counted correctly and the outcome reported in the final round of the tallying was correct. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicki. Oh, it sounds exciting. Believe, can we get the first 3 hands that are raised, and so we can move on to Dr. Kmart here? Do we have any hands?
There are actually no hands raised as of yet.
Great. Well, I won't ask my question, but it's Vicki, thank you so much. And thanks to all 3 of our state party chairs for what you're doing. Members, it's phenomenal what you're doing. And we just, I know our chair of our party appreciates everything you're doing. I know Ken Martin, you've got a great leader in Ken Martin. He's, besides being a good leader, he's a nice guy, a good guy, and a hard worker. So members, we've heard some excellent information about presidential caucus experience in 2020. We'll now open the floor. We've answered and asked the questions that I think our state party chairs are. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jim so we can move to the final segment of our meeting.
Well, I want to join Lorraine in thanking all of our state party chairs and our state party staffs, and for not just the presentation you've made today, which has been very helpful, but also for all the work you've done for a very successful caucus and primary process. And thank you, Lorraine, for bringing all that to us. We're now going to hear from our next guest, our fellow RBC member, Elaine Kmark, who is going to provide us with an overview of the role of automatic delegates and the impact of the reforms made for the 2020 process pertaining to automatic delegates. As a reminder to everybody, the 2020 reforms related to automatic delegates included the following: providing that automatic delegates would not vote on the first ballot of the presidential roll call unless a presidential candidate had secured more than enough pledged delegate certifications to secure the nomination. Allowing for automatic delegates to vote on a second and any subsequent ballot of a presidential roll call for the candidate of their choice, and allowing automatic delegates to vote on all other convention matters, including the vice presidential nomination and standing committee reports. Elaine, we really appreciate your willingness, as always, to present your analysis for us today, and we look forward to your observations. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I have unmuted myself, I take it?
You have.
All right, good. All right, well, let me try to do this in a couple minutes, quickly as I can, because I know we're already at our purported ending time. I've written a book called Primary Politics, which I think maybe the Rules Committee sent to all of you, or maybe to the new members. And I just want to say to the new members of the Rules Committee, I've not only been on the Rules Committee, but I've been a scholar of this topic for many years. This book is in its 3rd edition. So I'm happy if anybody wants to ask me questions as we get into this, just, call me up, send me an email, and I'm happy to talk to everybody about this. It is a passion of mine. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on it back in the dark ages and have been writing about it ever since. So let me start at the very beginning, 1831. In the entire period from 1831 to 1972, all nominating conventions in both parties were composed of superdelegates. There were virtually no presidential primaries during this period of time. And when there were primaries, which began in the early 1900s, they tended not to be binding. In fact, from 1932 to 1968, there were only between 14 and 17 primaries, and only 3 primaries were actually binding primaries. By that, I mean that the results of the primary dictated the presidential candidate that the delegates would be for. So for the bulk of the history of the Democratic and, for that matter, the Republican Party, primaries did not matter. The convention process was a semi-public process that went on as delegates were selected in basically state caucuses and conventions. Obviously, the 1968 convention changed all that. It was very disruptive. Anti-war protesters did not feel that they had gotten a fair shake at that convention. They didn't feel that their votes in the primaries were reflected in the delegates that went to Chicago. As you may remember, many of you from history books, some of us can remember in person, all hell broke loose at that convention. And the result was a reform commission. And the Reform Commission fundamentally changed the nominating process in the Democratic Party, and ironically, kind of accidentally in the Republican Party as well. So between 1972, starting in 1972, primaries became binding. And that really changed everything, because suddenly the action moved from the backroom deals of party leaders in states who were negotiating with presidential candidates to the primaries. Jack Kennedy campaigned for president in a couple of primaries, but mostly Jack and Bobby went state to state negotiating with state party leaders. Now, as this new system took place, one of the unintended consequences of the reform rules, and nobody really saw this or thought about it, was that very few leaders of the Democratic Party, House members, senators, or governors, actually went to conventions. And the reason was that none of them wanted to compete with their own constituents in caucuses for the 4 or 5 convention seats. And of course, once we instituted equal division between men and women, most of them were men, unfortunately still are, although we're getting better at that. So the party leaders were kind of cut out of the Democratic conventions. This became very evident in the hotly contested 1980 convention, where the floor, some of you may have been there, the floor action was incredibly intense. It was very contentious, and almost none of the leaders of the Democratic Party were there. Okay, they physically weren't there. Some of them were trying desperately to get onto the floor and couldn't. So as a result of the 1980 convention, the House Democrats particularly were stung by how powerless they were. And they banded together to ask the Hunt Commission to allow 2/3 of the House Democratic Caucus to be uncommitted delegates to the 1984 convention. This was supported by Jim Hunt, the former governor of North Carolina, who was chair of that commission. It was supported by the AFL-CIO and a lot of state party chairs at that point in time. It was opposed by Senator Kennedy, who was running against Vice President Mondale in 1980, or at least, was at that point, and it turned out that he didn't run, and felt that Mondale would have an edge among these House members. And it was opposed by feminists who argued that because the superdelegates at that point were overwhelmingly white and male, that it would really prevent the convention from being equally divided. So the original proposal was to have the superdelegates make up 30% of the convention. There was a compromise reached at 14%, which made it easier to preserve equal division of women and minorities by using the at-large portion. So the category of of superdelegates was expanded in later years to include all members of the DNC. And in 1992, Democrats elected 80% of House and Senate caucus members, plus DNC members, plus distinguished leaders. And by 2008, all Democratic members, senators, and congressmen, governors, and DNC members were automatic delegates. The important thing to remember is that in between the 1984 convention and the 2008 convention, we had superdelegates and nobody actually made a big deal about them. Part of that, I think, is because that was a kind of transitional period of time. There were still a lot of party leaders and activists during that period of time who had grown up in a period of time when everybody at the convention was a superdelegate. They weren't bound by primaries, and primaries were beauty contests only and didn't have a lot to do with the selection of delegates. This all changed in 2008 when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama found themselves in a very, very close race for delegates. Jeff Berman, our fellow committee member, can elaborate on that. It was so close that the superdelegate count became an important piece of the count. And early on, the superdelegate count favored Hillary Clinton. The Clinton campaign probably made a strategic mistake when they told the press that they could win because of the superdelegates. And the Obama campaign saw an opening and brought a full-scale campaign against the superdelegates and against having superdelegates vote for Hillary if she did not have a majority of the other delegates. And the Obama campaign pursued a fascinating two-track strategy, publicly arguing that the superdelegates were illegitimate, then they shouldn't overturn the will of the voters, and privately going after superdelegates who had not committed yet to Hillary. Yeah. By May 10th, given that Obama was winning, he had actually overtaken Clinton in the Associated Press count of the superdelegates. Now, the reason superdelegates is so controversial is that they, unlike the pledged delegates, are allowed to be uncommitted in a system that really doesn't have a tradition of uncommitted delegates anymore. And it's interesting because this goes smack into another controversy that has been consistent in our party and the Republican Party, which is, what is the role of a delegate? Are they allowed to vote their conscience? Or are they simply robots, as the Kennedy people called the Carter rule in 1980? Are they robots and they can only do what the primary told them to do? The compromise that came out of 1980 is still in our rules. And it reads, and I want to point this out, delegates elected to the National Convention pledged to a presidential candidate shall in all good conscience reflect the sentiments of those who elected them. So we're in this interesting situation where we basically have a pledged delegate nomination system, except for the superdelegates, and yet there is a loophole. So really, under certain circumstances, you could see actual pledged delegates deciding not to vote for somebody they were elected for. This, by the way, this role of delegates, are they robots or can they use their own judgment, was a big issue at the 2016 Republican convention by, of course, the Stop Trump movement and the Stop Trump people at that convention. And there were people at that convention. They argued that there should not be an automatic reflection of the delegates in the count. Obviously, they lost and Trump won the nomination. So this whole issue is kind of part and parcel of the role of delegates in and of themselves. And it became an issue again in the 2016 convention, where the Bernie Sanders campaign argued that superdelegates were basically undemocratic. And they added a new and very important twist to the argument against superdelegates, which was that they had an undue influence on the delegate count itself, and thus on momentum, because they had been included in delegate counts. And so as the 2016 convention ended, it created the Unity Commission, and the Unity Commission had robust and long debates over the wisdom of superdelegates, and it went to the Rules Committee. The upshot of that at the Rules Committee was what are now Rules 7B and 7C, which, and Jim alluded to this, automatic delegates vote only if there is a second ballot. It was felt that this was a good compromise for the following reasons. First of all, there was no chance that the superdelegates would overturn the will of the voters. Okay, they did not have a first ballot choice. They only got to vote if the convention didn't come to any conclusion. And it was also thought that that was exactly the situation that people worried about back in 1980 when superdelegates were created in the first place, which is, if in fact you have a situation where the primaries don't deliver a clear verdict, or a situation where something changes in the interim and there's a great controversy in the party leaders who run with the presidential candidate, and more importantly, who end up governing with the presidential candidate, need to have a say, not necessarily a definitive say, but they need to have a say in the process. So that's where we are. This issue raised, as you probably remember, there were heated arguments on both sides of it. In 2020, we didn't really have a test of this because Biden locked up the nomination fairly early. It was not contested. We did not even have a normal convention like we usually do. So we haven't really, there was really no way to see how this rule was working. But that's how we got here. And what we have to remember in this is, as in all democratic systems, is that democratic systems always are created from competing values, right? On the one hand is the value of the people rule and voters rule, et cetera. On the other hand is the value of keeping a party together and making sure that the governing pieces of the party are involved in the nomination process. After all, we could elect a president, but if a Democratic president, but if a Democratic Congress doesn't stick by the president, and as we're seeing day to day how important it is that every Democrat stick by Joe Biden, if that doesn't happen, then the Democratic president can't get done the things that we elected Democrats to do. So that's the quick version of this. There's much more. Also with me on the committee are experts like Jeff Berman, who was Obama's brilliant delegate hunter, Harold Ickes, who is slightly older than me, I'd like to say, but also like me can go back many years in remembering this, and Jim Roosevelt himself. So we've got a lot of rules junkies on this committee, and I hope that this has been helpful to everybody, and I'm free to answer questions or participate in discussion.
Thanks very much, Elaine. A great summary of a long and winding road. And I'm going to conduct this portion, even though I also think I'm slightly older than you. But
phew.
We will now open the floor for questions or comments from RBC members about the reforms regarding automatic delegates. If any RBC member would like to be recognized for comments or questions, just as we've been doing, please use the raise your hand feature in Zoom, or if you're having a connection problem, send something by chat or email. That will help us with staff assistance. create a queue that we'll use to call on each member. When it is your turn to speak, you will be announced and unmuted, and we'll do our best to call on as many members as we can. I'll just mention one comment myself, which is that when you referred to one of the topics in the debate in leading up to the 2020 rules as the automatic delegates being part of the delegate count in advance, that was the count that the Associated Press and CNN and so on did of essentially polling the automatic delegates. And there was a belief among some folks, particularly in the Sanders campaign, that created an inevitability that changed the outcome. So just to elaborate on that a little bit. Now, I'm going to go to one question that was submitted or comment that was submitted in the survey. And this is from Brian in Missouri. I believe that our efforts with regard to superdelegates were admirable, and I believe that those reforms worked. So that's one respondent's summation of what just happened. Philip, do we have anybody in the queue for questions or comments?
Yes, Chairman, we have Rebecca Higgins with the hand raised.
Oh, yes. Okay. Elaine, thank you so much. A comment first. I'm newly on the committee, as you know, and I'm a teacher. So I'm all about education. And what you just outlined for me, pieces and parts have been talked about that when we've had the committee in the last few years. But I'm furiously writing down everything that you were saying, because I think it's so important for all these newly engaged people that we've been hearing about in Alaska and Kansas and Wyoming, and I'm sure other places all across the United States. They need to hear things like this, because I have so many friends and members of Ohio Education Association when I was president, who in 2016 who were Bernie Sanders people who were just enraged about the whole superdelegate. The whole thing. They thought, like you said, that there was undue influence and it was illegitimate and everything. And I think knowing
I think we lost you, Rebecca.
Yeah.
Did we lose Rebecca?
I think so.
Yeah. Looks like we lost her. The whole.
I'm here.
You're back. Okay.
You're back.
We lost you, Rebecca, for a bit.
Yeah. But just knowing more information like this to give, which I have always done. I know I haven't spoke up a lot at meetings because, frankly, I will just say it. All of you have been lovely to me, but I was intimidated because I did not have all the knowledge that everybody seems like on that committee had. And so I have learned in these years, and I've taken that knowledge back to the members of OEA, back to my friends who were always complaining, always moaning and groaning. And I think that if we did a huge outreach, because I heard what you said at the end, you said, everybody stick by Joe Biden. And I think that to get everybody to stick by Joe Biden or whoever our candidate is the next time, it's going to take continued massive engagement and discussions. And I just thank you for what you gave me today, because I'm going to definitely go and use this over and over back here in Ohio.
That makes me very happy. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I will say, it takes several years to turn somebody into a rules geek, and I think we've done it with you. All right, Philip, who is the next questioner?
Yvette Lewis, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you. It looks like I am unmuted. Hi, Elaine. It's good to see you. We spent many hours sitting in those meetings, unity reform. in rules, eating it twice, more or less. But I just want to sort of second what was just said. I think we have a mission that we need to all make sure that we participate in moving forward for the next convention cycle, for the next cycle, is to make sure that we are reaching out and educating people. There's still toxicity associated with the term superdelegate. There's still toxicity associated with the word automatic delegate, because it implies that we have some type of advantage or we're a part of an elite class. And I think that we need to think about how we, instead of attaching a title to us who are out here working, we attach the works to the people, to the relationships that we have in the state, so that people don't see us as this isolated group that has this outweighed influence in our election process. I too have not been around as long, but I was involved enough in 16 and in this last cycle to know that we still have not gotten rid of that thing, that stink, if you will, that's been attached to all of us, that are even the word super. I mean, you know how hard we work to get rid of the word super and to refer to it as automatic, just because of that very thing. But I think we owe it to ourselves as members who are going to be electing the next president or re-electing the next president of the United States, that we, as I said, attach to that title of automatic delegate works. Because when I think about, for example, members of the Black Caucus that represent the most loyal constituency of the Democratic Party, and to have them painted with that swath is painful for me, as an African-American first, and as a woman who has worked hard to make sure that we win these elections. And so I think we have to make sure that we are defining ourselves in this upcoming cycle in a way that can't be distorted, and before people can redefine us in that negative way. So that's just something that I've sort of been stewing with a bit, and I think it's something we all need to think about.
Yeah. Thank you, Yvette. Very, very good observations. Philip, do we have one more question?
We do. We have one more question from Jeff Berman.
Jeff?
Hi, Jeff.
Yep. Hey, thank you. Elaine, excellent discussion there. I think it really accurately captured how this topic has existed for many years, and we've seen an evolution in it. We made a lot of strong reforms in this cycle, really across the board. We've talked about them in the prior hearing and then today, and the super or automatic delegates is a key component of it. And with all the changes we made, we had a very sort of unpredictable nominating process, and in significant part because of the COVID pandemic. We came through this and produced an excellent nominee and won the general election. And it's really important to keep in mind that we made a lot of really positive reforms, and everything worked to produce a winning election for the Democratic Party. So I just think as we look at all these issues, we should always keep that in mind. A lot of good work was done. But anyway, thanks, Elaine, for capturing all of that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And I think Philip, do we have one more?
Yep, one more from Donna Brazil.
Well, thank you, Elaine, for your explanation. And as someone who's been involved in this party since I was, when I first registered, that's been a long, long time. I want you to explain the invisible primary and how that that conversation, which the media would always start 2 years before a presidential season, how the quote unquote invisible primary made automatic delegates sort of like the boogie man or boogie woman, because of the way the media would call us all in advance and say, hey, I want to know if you're going to be supporting X or Y. I do believe that is part of why this well got poisoned. It didn't get poisoned because I had 2 votes or 3 votes or 4 votes. I had 1 vote. You had 1 vote, but it got poisoned because of this so-called the media had to somehow or another gauge what was going on before the process started, before we went to Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, et cetera. So I just want you to explain that invisible primary. And the second thing is, has the number of automatic delegate ever exceeded the number of pledged delegates?
No.
No.
The number of automatic, that's the easier one, Donna. The number of automatic delegates has always been a fraction well under 20% of the pledged delegates. So, you know, think about it this way. If the automatic delegates were to have an impact, say on a second ballot, which is our current rules, it would have to be a situation where either we had like 3 candidates, each of which was sort of dividing up the pie, or you had 2 candidates that were with razor thin margins, you know, maybe less than 20 delegates or something. I mean, it would have to be a very, very unusual situation that hasn't happened. Now, the fact that it hasn't happened doesn't mean that it could happen.
Well,
Every 4 years, I have to tell reporters, yes, conventions are sort of obsolete, but that doesn't mean they will always be obsolete. At some point in one party or the other, there's going to be a convention where the primaries do not make a decision. And the other thing that happens in conventions is that situations change. So a candidate who's racking up delegates in March and April, maybe we find out something about them in May and June that we don't like so much. So things change. And I think there the automatic delegates would be important. But frankly, if the automatic delegates are changing their minds, I believe in this day and age that the pledged delegates are also changing their minds. They're looking at that rule and they're saying, in all good conscience, I'm going to change my mind. And the invisible primary, you're absolutely right. The press makes a big fuss out of that. Not only do they look to state party people and DNC members to see who they're supporting, sometimes months before the field is even formed, they look at money. Okay, they look at the money primary. And I mean, just to give, first of all, if you were looking at money in February of this year, you were not betting on Joe Biden. Okay, if you were looking on the Republican side, if you were looking at money in 2016, you were not betting on Donald Trump. Okay, because, you know, Jeb Bush had gobs and gobs of money. So the indicators in the invisible primary are really often wrong and misleading. And I think that we all have an obligation as speakers and leaders of the party to just hold back. I mean, how many times have I said to reporters, I don't know, it's too early. We can't tell. Don't write that. Right? It's just too damn early. Things change. We don't even have a full cast of characters. And so I think that as party leaders, we would, following your advice, Donna, we would do the party a great service by tamping down this excessive speculation in the invisible primary season, both of the members of Congress and of the press and the money game.
Thank you so much. I do believe that our party leaders, officials, and activists deserve to have, equal access to helping to choose our nominee. That's my view, and I will stand by it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. And thank you again, Elaine. I think, Philip, am I correct? We've come to the end of our list?
You're correct, Chairman.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah.
I just wanted to see if Elaine had her comments kind of in writing that she could send to Rick and that he could share it. I think Rebecca's comment about this is so educational. It would be so helpful to everybody. For the old heads to reinforce, and for the new folks, it's good, concrete information. So if you have your notes where you could send something to Rick, that would be great.
Yeah, Rick and I will work that out. Okay, because I do have some notes, but I can actually take some pages out of the book and send them out. They're written better than my notes.
And the book is great.
Thank you.
The book is great. And I see that we now, Philip, maybe have a couple more hands raised.
Yes, we do. We have one, David Mcdonald.
David?
Thank you, Phil. Elaine, this comment does not actually relate to your presentation. I was waiting till the end of the speakers. It's a general comment about the reforms that we did and have looked at today, particularly the caucus reform, but it, I think, goes through the rest. We were implementing generally a philosophy this last cycle that a candidate's delegate should be determined based on the vote that happens the day of the event. You know, we changed the caucus rules to say it has to be projected out on the first basis. We ended up in a situation because of the withdrawn candidates where we had to then figure out what happened with withdrawn candidates, delegates. And then even further down the road with respect to Sanders and Biden, with respect to the at-large and committee positions. And effectively, they solved it by doing a deal between the candidates that we ended up honoring. And I don't think that's a good, healthy outcome on its face, that candidates should not be deciding what our rules are after the fact. We need to figure them out in advance. But more generally, I was not unhappy with their solution. And I just wanted to flag that perhaps the next committee would want to either adopt their solution but put it into a rule, or otherwise be very clear about who's entitled to what. As I indicated in the last hearing, I'm generally of the view that we shouldn't throw away people's issues content by simply deciding who the nominee is going to be. So I was, as I said, happy with the solution that the Sanders forces continue to get their committee positions as opposed to being eliminated. But I'm not happy with the fact that we had two candidates after the fact essentially rewrite a rule to work out however they wanted to do it. It's a good political outcome, but I don't think it's a good governance outcome for future cycles. Thank you.
Thanks for that observation. That I think will also contribute to our deliberations next time, David. And Philip, do we have one more?
No, Chairman, we are all set. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you again to Elaine for great insights, but also to the very good questions as well. And thanks to everyone for their participation. I'm going to turn this back to Lorraine at this point.
Great. Again, Jim has already said thank you to our state party chairs, and Elaine, as always, you are always insightful, and we all appreciate you. So members, we've come to the end of our agenda for today. And Jim and I really want to thank you for your time and your invaluable insight that you've given to this very important process. I hope you really appreciate that we can't do this work without your input. And as we get closer to the fall DNC meeting, our beloved secretary, Jason Ray, will be getting back in touch with you about the details. We hope to see you all in person so we can hug and kiss and catch up on all of our political gossip. In the meantime, please stay in touch with us and let us know if you have any additional thoughts or ideas on the topics that we're discussing. Please continue to stay healthy and help to encourage everyone to get the vaccine. And Rick is always available to take any of your questions, as Jim and I are. The chair will now entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Artie. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Are there any opposers? Seeing and hearing no objections, our meeting is adjourned. Safe travels, everyone. Be safe. Good to see you.
Everyone, be safe.
Bye.